Charlie.
You're welcome.
Okay, I want to introduce to you Avigail Abarbanel. And Avigail, would you raise your hand just so people would know who you are? Yes, okay, and see your face. First time I stumbled upon Avigail was when I read her rather extensive article. It was an agonized article in many ways in the January issue of Wonderwise. It was both stunning and heartrending. She entitled it, "Why I Left the Cult." And right then, it occurred to me that we don't get to hear this perspective from Israelis. So I made contact, and here we are. We're very, very fortunate to have Avigail Abarbanel with us today to give us an inside look into Zionism, as well as her own real awakening to Zionism's intrinsic nature. And with this, I want to say welcome to you, Avigail.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you, Huda, for the introduction, and good morning, good day, or evening to everyone, wherever you are in the world. Thank you to the organizers, to all who are present, and to those who will listen to the recording at a later stage. I'm grateful for the invitation to speak to you. For anyone who's interested, the text of this talk and some slides that I've prepared will be available to download from tomorrow through a link that I will give to the organizers. I will also make the talk available on academia.edu for those of you who have access to it. My purpose in speaking about Palestine is, of course, to lend my voice to the voices of the Palestinian people in the hope that the world finally listens to their plight and does the right thing. When the world's powers repeatedly and habitually collude with perpetrators of crimes against humanity, it remains up to activists as individuals and in groups to speak out and try to lead to change. But it is not easy to do this in a hostile atmosphere where those who commit the crime also control the narrative about the crime. In the case of Israel in particular, activists have been facing something that I've been familiar with from my early childhood in Israel. It is the accusation that anyone who criticizes Israel is guilty of the crime of racism against Jews, also called anti-Semitism. Therefore, another hope I have in speaking is that through talks such as this, I can help activists stand firm against baseless accusations of anti-Semitism, which are an attempt to disable and silence the critic. Accusations of anti-Semitism are also intended to deflect attention away from the crime and the suffering of the victims, and from those who are perpetrating the crime. I hope that by the time I finish my talk, you will feel more confident about speaking out and you will not allow yourself to be silenced or confused. In her short story, The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas, my favorite author, the late Ursula Le Guin, tells the tale of the happy, perfect city of Omelas. All the citizens of Omelas live peacefully in beautiful surroundings in their well-tended city. But the city has a secret. In order for the citizens of Omelas to enjoy this incredible perfection, a single child must always be kept locked up in a dark dungeon beneath the city. The child is kept in nakedness and darkness. It is not well fed nor treated well, and it is not allowed to develop or thrive. It is kept in filth and deprivation, the epitome of utter misery. From time to time, people go down to visit the dungeon and look at the child. Sometimes they're affected by what they see. They feel disgusted or disturbed, but then they go back up to their beautiful sunny city, put what they saw out of their minds, and get on with their perfect lives. No matter how they feel about it, they accept that this child kept in the dungeon is the price that has to be paid, the sacrifice that has to be made for the continued happiness and the perfection of their existence. The last paragraph of the story reads, and I quote, "At times, one of the adolescent girls or boys who go to see the child does not go home to weep or rage, does not in fact go home at all. Sometimes also a man or woman much older falls silent for a day or two, and then leaves home. These people go out into the street and walk down the street alone. They keep walking and walk straight out of the city of Omelas, through the beautiful gates. They keep walking across the farmlands of Omelas. Each one goes alone, youth or girl, man or woman. Night falls. The traveler must pass down village street between houses with yellow lit windows and on out into the darkness of the fields. Each alone, they go west or north towards the mountains. They go on. They leave Omelas. They walk ahead into the darkness and they do not come back. The place they go towards is a place even less imaginable to most of us than the city of happiness. I cannot, it does not exist, but they seem to know where they're going, the ones who walk away from Omelas. I used this quote in a paper I wrote back in 2003 when I was still in Canberra in Australia and was still wrestling with the experience of leaving Zionism, my version of Omelas. The paper, differentiating from Israel, was published in a peer-reviewed family therapy journal because family therapy theory can inform us a great deal about topics such as this. In many ways, this is the focus of this talk. Some background and a few disclaimers, quote unquote. When I began to speak out for what the unfair treatment of the Palestinian people back in 2001 in Australia, I thought I was a lone voice. The reactions around me seemed to reinforce this impression. Back then, most people have not heard of anyone with my background who openly questioned Israel or who was prepared to speak and write about it publicly. I am a former Israeli citizen, born and bred in Israel. I served my full term in the Israeli military, and I'm a granddaughter of Holocaust survivors. It didn't take long for me to realize the advantage that my accidental, quote-unquote, credentials were offering me. I thought that given the general support for Israel around the world and the indifference, even widespread hostility towards the Palestinians, there was a better chance that people would listen to me. I felt that it was my duty to use who I am and my background to support the Palestinian cause simply because my voice was more likely to be heard. But soon, I also began to feel uncomfortable. I realized that Jewish and Jewish Israeli voices were being listened to quite readily, but I wasn't sure how many Palestinians got the opportunity to speak publicly and have their stories heard by people who were really prepared to listen. I still don't think that my story is that important. In a caring and compassionate world, victims shouldn't need others to speak for them just to validate their experience of suffering, injustice, and victimhood. Surely victims everywhere, humans who suffer at the hands of other humans, should expect to be heard and supported directly and unconditionally by everyone. Yet the evidence from studies on trauma, for example, points repeatedly to the fact that if someone was a victim early in life, they are much more likely to be victimized repeatedly throughout their life compared with people who have never suffered trauma or mistreatment. The world as it is does not like victims. More often than not, victims are dismissed, ignored, maligned, and dehumanized. They're often further abused or let down by the very people or organizations that are supposed to help them. Many people would like to believe that if someone has been victimized, they must have done something to deserve it. Most people need their world to make sense. It does not make sense to most people that someone can be victimized randomly just because they happen to be at the wrong place at the wrong time, or because they had something someone else coveted, or for no reason at all. So the attitude of finding fault in victims and blaming victims for their own suffering is sadly the prevailing attitude almost everywhere. The second disclaimer is the following. When I spoke up, I was often told I was courageous, quote unquote. That too puzzled me. What is wrong with our human affairs that it should require courage to state the obvious, to speak out against crime, or to protect and advocate for victims? Why do we need courage to do the right thing? Why is it not straightforward? I don't have the time in this talk to address these important issues. Perhaps we will have time later in the discussion, or you might want to reflect on them in your own time. And my third point, or disclaimer, over the years, I've been asked many times about the losses I have suffered for speaking out and the personal price I have paid. I want to make it absolutely clear that whatever losses I might have suffered because of my choice to stand with the victims of my people instead of with my people do not even begin to compare with what every Palestinian has suffered from the moment Zionism began to create a foothold in Palestine. Whatever losses I might have suffered, I have also gained a great deal. I have met incredible people that I would not have met if I hadn't spoken out, and I can live with myself and can die well when my time comes. A little bit about growing up in Israel. I was born in Tel Aviv in 1964 and grew up in Bat Yam, in downtown Israel, as I call it, a side of Israel of which few people are aware. I don't know if this is still the case these days, but when I started to speak out, Israel was still largely romanticized and had something of an idealized image in the Western world. Influenced by popular culture and by Israel's sophisticated and relentless propaganda machine, the Hasbara, many outside Israel believed the same myths that we inside Israel were taught at school. They believed that we, the Jews who settled Palestine, were heroic people who triumphed over millennia of oppression and victimhood and rose from the ashes of the Holocaust to make the desert bloom, quote unquote. They believed, as we ourselves were taught, that we brought progress to a primitive land filled with malaria-infested swamps, a backward and largely empty land. People thought of us as courageous, hopeful, peace-loving pioneers, and this is what school taught us we were. When people thought about Israel, they thought of the lovely rural scenery of the kibbutz, of ingenuity, of progress, courage, and idealism. But this fictitious and fraudulent image couldn't be further, not only from reality and the reality of the Palestinians, but also from my personal experience. Bat Yam, where I grew up, was an ugly and soulless urban desert with social problems, poverty, drugs, alcohol, family breakdown, and crime. These were caused largely by the way Israel treated the Arabic-speaking Mizrahi Jews it shipped en masse in the 1950s from countries like Morocco, Iraq, and the Yemen. They were hastily put out of sight, housed in makeshift shantytowns called, in Hebrew, ma'abarot, meaning transit camps, in Bat Yam and elsewhere. Israel was in a rush to improve its demographics. The more Jews, the better. It was not interested in people's welfare, especially not the welfare of Mizrahi Jews, who were perceived as in the dominant Ashkenazi culture as primitive and inferior, not much difference to how Ashkenazi culture viewed Arabs, quote unquote. The migrants were promised good housing and work to entice them to leave their good and often well-to-do lives in their home countries, where their ancestors lived for millennia. But when they arrived in Israel, they were housed in tents and corrugated iron shacks. These were supposed to be temporary, but lasted decades. These proud families with a rich culture and history were thrown into abject poverty and deprivation. The word ma'abara came to mean something negative, but it was not the people's fault. One of those ma'abarot was only a few minutes' walk from my primary school. These transit camps were finally demolished, but not before generations of those proud Mizrahi Jewish families were destroyed through displacement, poverty, racism, and discrimination. They were the black, quote unquote, of Israeli Jewish society, the blacks, and suffered decades of racism and discrimination, not unlike African Americans. We lived in one of 16 almost identical flats in a square building over a noisy street where the walls were thin and everybody knew what went on in everybody else's flat. Those buildings were built in a hurry during the 1960s, mostly by Palestinian laborers from Gaza, exploited as slave labor. Labor laws and employment rights were reserved for Jews only. Walking to and from school down our densely built up street, I watched those men build endless rows of almost identical buildings. I didn't know who these men were. All I knew was that they were Arabs, that they were dangerous, and that I should ignore them, hurry up when passing a building site, and never speak to them. We lived in better conditions than the people of the Ma'abarot. We were the whites, quote unquote, of Jewish Israeli society. My father was born in Palestine to a Greek Jewish mother and a Turkish Jewish father. He was a Middle Eastern Jew with a darker skin, but he did not suffer racism because he did not speak Arabic, and his accent was not the same as the Mizrahi Jews who came from Arabic-speaking countries. He used to make jokes about Moroccan Jews in particular, whom he saw as violent and primitive, and that was the prevailing attitude in society in general. My mother was the daughter of German-speaking Romanian Jews from Bucharest. They and two of their children survived forced labor camps in Romania. My grandmother had 4 children when she was sent to the camp. The 2 younger ones died of starvation and disease. The 2 older ones survived just. My mother, who was born at the end of the war as a refugee in Bucharest, always saw herself as white, European, and superior, as did her parents when they encountered Mizrahi Jews in Israel. I was in effect mixed race, quote unquote, by Israeli standards, but still not doing quite as badly as the Black Jews. Because my skin is slightly darker than that of European Jews, I was referred to occasionally in my 20s as that Iraqi woman. Not many people are aware of the Israel that I knew as a child. It was a harsh, nasty, unkind, and racist place, even to its own people. But my real problem was in my own family. As a child, I was severely abused in a number of ways for years by both my parents, each in their preferred ways. My abusers, my parents, were Jewish, not Palestinian, Muslim, or Christian. At school, I was repeatedly told that we Jews were innately more moral and ethical than all other people, but my ongoing nightmare at home made me recognize instinctively, albeit unconsciously at the time at my age, that Jews were not special, certainly not innately more moral or ethical. Not all anti-Zionist Jews had a bad childhood. Many activists I know grew up in safe and loving families. Their journeys out of Zionism are different to my own. This became especially obvious to me when I edited the book Beyond Tribal Loyalties, Personal Stories of Jewish Peace Activists, and had the privilege of collating and editing the stories of others who have been through a similar journey to my own. But my history of childhood abuse played an important role in what was to become a kind of an awakening later in life. When you grow up in a schizophrenic universe with one reality on the surface and something quite different and quite nasty hidden underneath, you learn that sometimes things are not what they seem. You learn to not just trust automatically or believe everything you're told about how things are. I served in the Israeli army between 1982 and 1984. During my service and under Prime Minister Menachem Begin and Defense Minister Ariel Sharon, Israel invaded Lebanon a second time. Many years later, as the dots were starting to join up, I realized that my unit in the central headquarters of the army in Tel Aviv and my commanding officer, whom I adored, played a role in the Sabra and Shatila massacre in September 1982. Although I have not killed anyone myself, the kind of highly classified work I did for the army meant that I colluded with this crime against humanity, albeit as a small cog in a large machine. During that time, my boyfriend, who was an officer in the Armored Corps, was rewarded for murdering Palestinians in southern Lebanon using what was then classified new tank-mounted heat-seeking technology provided by the United States. Other very close friends who served in the Israeli Navy indiscriminately bombed civilian buildings in Beirut from the sea, killing, traumatizing, and displacing many innocent Lebanese people. Other close friends who served in the Air Force bombed or helped bomb civilian targets in Lebanon. Israeli soldiers invaded civilian homes in the south of Lebanon, looted and defaced private homes and properties. None of us debated or questioned the morality of this. We did not have a concept of ourselves as people who could do bad things. We believed we were at war, that we had no choice about, and were just serving our country. We believed we were doing our duty, each in our own way, to help our country survive enemies who wanted to destroy us for no other reason than us being Jews. When we managed to get a weekend pass, we did what most young people did, try to distract ourselves and avoid reality as much as possible. Our concerns were centered mostly around ourselves and our little existence. I moved to Australia in November 1991 at the age of 27 with my first husband, who was a captain in the Israeli army. I left Israel not because I was politically enlightened. I was a university student at the time, and one of my majors was political science. One day I attended a seminar organized by our department, which hosted the future generations of the Likud and Labour Party. They spoke to us about their respective visions for the future of Israel. When I came home after that event, I felt depressed. It was then that I felt we had to leave. It was obvious from listening to both parties that neither saw anything for the future of Israel except a life by the sword. I could not imagine my future in such a place where war, tension, and militarism were never going to end. I was not afraid for my life or safety. I was afraid of suffocating in Israel's anxious pressure cooker. I did not think about the Palestinians. I only thought about myself. It was during that year at university that I came across the word Palestinians for the first time. I was 25 then, by the way. The professor who used that word spoke about how Palestinians were forced into the lowest economic rung in Israeli society. I remember being genuinely puzzled. I didn't know who the Palestinians were. I then began to understand that my professor was talking about the same people I was taught to see as the inferior other, the bad Aravim, the Arabs. He was talking about the same people I was supposed to fear and despise, and whom I was supposed to see as my sworn enemy. This professor didn't just talk about these people as human beings, he expressed concern and compassion for their condition. In that context, the economic injustice our state was inflicting on them. The word Palestinians did not exist in our vocabulary or in Israel's collective consciousness, because to call a people by their name is to recognize their existence. Israel did not recognize the existence of the Palestinian people, and I did not meet a Palestinian as an equal until 2001, 10 years after moving to Australia. I know I harbored some uninformed, unnamed doubts that were percolating quietly under the surface. I describe this disjointed collection of early life impression and experiences in my story in Beyond Tribal Loyalties. My path to living Zionism was not a simple or straightforward one. It was made out of little experience that made little sense in their time, but it ended up gradually joining together to the picture that I now recognize as the Zionist ethnic cleansing of Palestine and its settler colonial project. In 1997, I began my graduate degree in individual and relationship psychotherapy at the Jansen Newman Institute in Sydney. It was in our second year, when we trained in family therapy, that I became acquainted with Murray Bowen's work, and in particular, his differentiation of self theory. What Murray Bowen called differentiation of self is a process of growing from our primary group, usually our family of origin, and maturing into the unique individuals we have the potential to become. Bowen defined differentiation as, and I quote, the amount of self you have in you, unquote, and thought of it as being on a scale from the bottom up. At the bottom of the scale are people who are not well differentiated and do not possess a good sense of self. They tend to be governed by their emotions, are reactive, and have trouble standing in the world as separate beings. They tend to try to remain enmeshed in their relationships and tend to be chronically fearful or anxious. As differentiation improves and people move up the imaginary scale, their sense of self becomes more solid. They are less governed by their emotions, and they are capable of living their life based on their own values without feeling anxious. They can maintain their sense of self in close relationships. The lower the differentiation, the more likely people are to oscillate between conformity and rebellion, much like teenagers do. The higher the differentiation, the more stable people's identity becomes across situations and groups. People feel secure to be authentically themselves and live consciously according to their beliefs and principles in relationship with others. My late teacher and mentor, Dr. David Jansen, believed that if we, as psychotherapy students, did not commit to the ongoing process of increasing our level of self-differentiation, we had no right to sit in front of clients. He argued that poorly differentiated therapists are less likely to be safe to their clients and will not be able to offer them much. A year-long differentiation of self project was a compulsory part of our degree. We were required to apply Bowen's theory to ourselves and engage actively in the process of increasing our own level of differentiation from our family of origin. Without completing this project satisfactorily, we could not graduate. The expectation was that we would engage fully in this difficult process. It had to be written up, and we had to show evidence of the impact the process had on us. Going through this process included looking at our family history as far back as we could, honestly and objectively. Among other things, we had to examine the values, principles, and beliefs that the family has passed on to us down the generations, consciously or not, intentionally or not, and think about how these impacted on our development, our identity, character, and choices. We had to evaluate how much of what we were given by our family's history was helpful to our development and how much wasn't. We were encouraged to think about this objectively and decide what we wish to keep and what we would want to discard. Bowen believed that we have a choice about this, and he wanted us to exercise this choice. What Bowen was not so good at is looking at the emotional impact or the cost of such a process. This is something I had to learn myself. In 1999, after my graduation, I moved to Canberra, where I began working in private practice. During my first 2 years in practice in Canberra, two processes began to unfold at the same time. One was in my external reality, and the other one internally. In 2001, I renounced my Israeli citizenship after Ariel Sharon's infamous march to the Al-Aqsa Mosque that sparked the Second Intifada. The only way I can describe what I felt was that I was fed up with Israel's behavior. I was angry at what looked to me like a flagrant display of unnecessary brute power by a narcissist thug and his helpers. Renouncing my citizenship was my symbolic way of expressing my desire to not be a part of that country. I felt that although I lived far away, as long as I carried an Israeli passport and an ID card, I was still complicit in what Israel was doing. I was angry and determined, but at the same time felt shaky and fearful. I was troubled by worries about what the people at the Israeli consulate in Sydney might have thought of me when I contacted them to inquire about renouncing my citizenship. I was fearful of being judged. My act was morally correct, but it was motivated by a feeling of rebellion, indignation, and anger mixed in with a lot of self-doubt. A few months earlier, I heard Professor Avi Shleim speak on radio about his new book, The Iron Wall. I was deeply disturbed by what he said, but ordered the book anyway. It was hard to read. That book caused me to question everything I thought I knew about Israel's history and the conflict, so-called conflict with the Palestinian people. The book told me that everything I was taught and believed to be true was in fact a lie. Externally, I was increasingly exposed to narratives that challenged my beliefs and my identity. Israel kept doing bad things that, despite Australia's general sympathy for Israel, were still being reported in the media. I couldn't hide from what I was seeing and hearing. It was really happening, and it was obvious the Palestinians were harmed and were suffering. I began to take part in rallies that supported the Palestinian plight and began to publish opinion pieces in the Canberra Times. I was increasingly invited to be a speaker in rallies and other protests and educational events, many by trade union groups or socialist groups that were sympathetic to the Palestinian people. I was invited and welcomed as a speaker by Muslim groups and organizations all over Australia, and was also invited by progressive Jewish groups, especially in Sydney, who wanted to hear what I had to say. My background seemed to offer me credibility and a foot in the door. As a result of what I was writing, I was also increasingly approached by Australian Palestinians and by people from all the Arab countries that I was raised to see as my sworn mortal enemy. This was the first time in my life that I met Palestinians and people from Arab countries as equals and really heard what they had to say. I remember thinking more than once, I wonder what so-and-so in Israel would think if they saw me now. One of the people I met through a Canberra-based pro-Palestinian group I joined was Ali Kazak. Ali was at the time the head of the Palestinian delegation to Australia, the equivalent of an ambassador, except Palestine isn't an independent state, so they only had a delegation. Ali made a point of meeting and spending time with all the groups and the individuals who expressed support for the Palestinian cause. He always insisted that if we wanted to support the Palestinians, we should work with Palestinians. Ali saw something in me that I was blind to at the time. In my own mind, I was a nice person who cared about my fellow humans, was prepared to speak out against injustice and abuse, and could empathize with human suffering. But I still did not understand the reasons for the so-called conflict between Israel and the Palestinians, for Israel's strong feelings against them, and for the suffering of the Palestinian people. I did not know why they were angry with us, and I didn't know that I was a Zionist. Ali recognized this because he saw the same thing many times before in well-meaning Jewish people. He could see that I did not know about the ethnic cleansing on Palestine, and that I did not question Israel's right to exist as an exclusively Jewish state at the expense of an entire people. He saw that I still had an unconscious sense of entitlement. In one of our meetings, Ali challenged me and mentioned the word colonialism. Ali was right, of course. Zionism, from what I learned at school, was an idealistic, mostly socialist movement that we identified with noble values like social justice, equality, secularism, and progress. Zionism was presented at school as the political manifestation of the yearning of our people, quote unquote, to return to our, quote unquote, ancestral land after 2,000 years of exile and of persecution. We were taught that the land was empty and that the small, quote unquote, number of Arabs who did live on it were just hired peasants from other Arab countries who occupied the land, but didn't come from there. They did not really belong there, but just lived there temporarily. Regardless of who occupied the land before us, we were taught we had a right to have a state of our own, a Jewish safe haven, free from persecution. We were taught it was okay to do whatever it took to ensure our survival, that the end justified the means. There was never any discussion of the morality of this. Survival was everything. It never occurred to me to question what Zionism did or to see it for what it is, a settler colonial project intended to replace the indigenous people of Palestine with Jews, the non-Jewish indigenous people of Palestine with Jews. We were given an almost watertight, simplistic narrative that was difficult to question. The gaps in the narrative were papered over by lies or omissions. If pushed to the corner, the argument was that as Jews, we were always under existential threat, and it was us or them. I remember feeling confused and disoriented, almost physically dizzy, when Ali challenged me. I had no idea what he was talking about, and I didn't know what to say, but the seed was planted. At the same time, in my psychotherapy practice, I had a wave of cult leavers who came to see me for therapy. Some had already left their groups, and some were trying to leave and were being harassed in a number of ways, both as a form of punishment for leaving and as a pressure to go back. As I heard the stories and listened to these clients' struggles, I began to realize that I understood them and even identified with them more than I had expected. I found it strange and wondered about why it was that I really understood the turbulent and intensely difficult experience of living a cult. As my activism was developing and growing, so were my internal struggles and turmoil. I began to realize the similarities between my cult survivor clients' psychological struggles as they were living their groups or contemplating living, and my own feelings as I was learning more and more about Zionism and Israel's true history. In those days, I felt a lot of fear and shame. I felt like a bad person. Each time I sat down to write an article, usually in response to something Israel did, each time I was supposed to speak at a rally or attend another function with people I was raised to think of as my enemy, I felt like I was doing something terribly wrong. I felt shame and a paralyzing fear, sometimes before I spoke and sometimes as a backlash after speaking event or after something I wrote had been published. My feelings were reinforced by an avalanche of hate mail I started to receive, threatening, weird phone calls in the middle of the night and death threats. This was something I was neither expecting nor prepared for. I didn't just have troubling feelings of my own. Others now confirmed to me that I was a bad person, a traitor to my people, and that I was so bad that I deserved to die for it. The word traitor in particular was mentioned more times than I can count, along with Nazi, or being labeled a person filled with hatred, and the now well-known phrase self-hating Jew. I was subjected to unsolicited amateur psychoanalysis that declared me insane, or somebody who was unconsciously and unfairly projecting my unresolved childhood anger against my mother on innocent Israel. I was told that by speaking out, I was giving ammunition to the anti-Semites, quote unquote, thus aiding and abetting the enemies of my people, which therefore made me a member of the enemy group. In one ongoing and particularly threatening attack, I was told, put up or shut up. There was no doubt that these attacks were intended to silence me. If I acted on my intense and troubled feelings, I would have stopped what I was doing and kept my mouth shut. I did consider this option, albeit briefly on a number of occasions for a while, and for a while there, I was really frightened. This was a difficult time, but it made me curious. Why should speaking out for what I believed? Why should supporting a group victimized by injustice and violence elicit such feelings in me? And why did my actions invite such a violent and threatening reaction from members of my own group? I realized something was strange here, something that I needed to look into. One thing I knew was that my fears and the guilt and the shame I felt did not begin with these threats. They were in me before the threats began. The threats just pressed on those buttons, quote unquote, triggered and reinforced those feelings. I experienced these feelings from the moment I began to even contemplate speaking out. There was an innate recognition in me that I was crossing a line I was not supposed to cross, and that I was breaking one of the most important rules I was brought up with. You can feel sympathy for others, yes, but you don't air the dirty laundry on our people, especially not to Gentiles, even if you don't like what Israel is doing. Eventually, the penny dropped. I realized that differentiating from my family of origin, the process I went through 4 years earlier in the second year of my degree, was not enough. If I wanted to continue to do what I was doing without being tortured by constant fears and self-doubt, I now needed to differentiate from my entire country, the society and culture that raised me and that in important ways also shaped me. My education in family therapy, especially Mary Bowen's work, offered me the validation I needed for my feelings. It made me realize that what I was feeling was understandable under the circumstances. It also gave me the intellectual framework to make sense of everything I was going through. Bowen argued that all human beings experienced a tension between togetherness and separateness throughout their lives. On one side, we are pulled by our natural need to be a part of our group and feel accepted by those who matter to us and to whom we are attached. On the other, we are pulled by our equally natural human need to develop our unique identity and reach our potential. But why should there be a tension between belonging to a group and becoming an individual? The answer is that most human groups require sameness and conformity as the price of belonging. The more psychologically enmeshed the group, the more it will resist the process of differentiation of individuals within it. The more secure and mature the group, the more it values diversity and independent thinking and will not see those as a threat to group survival. My differentiation process from Israel made me look at some of the beliefs Israeli society had instilled in me. Some of these beliefs are: everyone has always hated us, the Jews, and this is unique to us. No other people is or ever has been as hated as we are, and our suffering can never be compared to anyone else's. We are always under threat of annihilation, and another Holocaust is imminent. The hatred against us, anti-Semitism, is special and not like ordinary racism. Anti-Semitism is like a genetic mental illness that is passed on through the generations in the non-Jewish world, and it will always be there. All non-Jews are potentially anti-Semitic, even if they appear nice and friendly. Non-Jews cannot be trusted because one day they will turn against us again, and those who do not will turn their backs on us and will do nothing to help us. We are different from all other people. We are more moral, we are more ethical, just, moral, intelligent, and by nature more democratic than any other group on earth. This is the main reason we are hated. The Holocaust was unique. It cannot and must never be compared with any other genocide. Learning a universal lesson from the Holocaust is to deny its uniqueness, and it is what anti-Semites do. There have always been attempts to annihilate us. It goes right back to biblical times. The Holocaust was the most recent in a series of attempts and the most calculating, well-organized and comprehensive attempt. Another belief: the world is unsafe for Jews. Any feelings of safety are either a delusion or they are temporary. Israel is the only place in the world where Jews can be safe, but because everyone hates us, they do not want us to have the state, our state, so we always have to fight for its existence. The Jews who died in the Holocaust were weak. They went like sheep to the slaughter, quote unquote. Israel's role is to create a powerful new Jew, quote unquote, who will never again be a victim. Next point: we're a peace-loving people. All our wars are imposed on us. Wars of no choice. In Hebrew, they're called milchamot en brera. Second last point: our Israeli Defense Force is the most moral in the world. It's only for defense. It never attacks without provocation. It never hurts innocent people. Last point for now, anyone who does not like Israel or who criticizes it is an anti-Semite. It was not difficult to see why I felt such an affinity with cult leaders. The characteristics of the Jewish-Israeli belief system I grew up with are identical to the belief system of many cults. For example, cults tend to believe they are special and different from the rest of the world. Cults tend to be fearful and consider the group to always be under existential threat. Cult members are often told the world out there is dangerous to them and the only safety for them is in and with the group. Group members are often told they are misunderstood or hated by those outside the group. In many cults, the survival of the cult is seen as the most important value, and it has to come, it must come before anything else. Conforming to the cult's beliefs and way of life is the key to group and therefore individual survival. People should accept conformity as the price they pay for belonging. Cults differ in their levels of oppression. The degree to which questioning a cult's beliefs or thinking independently is allowed is proportionate to how oppressive the group is. The more threatened and insecure the group, the more oppressive it is likely to be. Everyone in the group knows the boundaries that cannot be crossed. These are taught from the start of life and are reinforced throughout life by the cult's teaching and its rituals and practices. Individual identity is secondary to the identity of the group provides, or rather, individual identity becomes synonymous with group identity. Loyalty to the group is the highest value each individual can have in their life. Loyalty is absolute, even if members think the group is doing something wrong. Typically, in cults, it is not permissible to discuss with the outside world what is going on in the cult. This is considered disloyal and a threat to the group. What I'm referring to in this list is in fact cult psychology. Cult psychology is typical of enmeshed family systems, and it can exist in almost any context of group interaction. It does not have to be religious. It is a type of pack mentality that must have evolved in hostile conditions when humans were under constant mortal threat. Gathering together in groups proved a better guarantee of individual survival than being alone, and preserving the group must have become a priority if people wanted to survive. There are those who are born into this kind of psychology and are indoctrinated into it, as I was, and there are people who join later. Cult psychology tends to draw to itself people who are already fearful and who are looking for clarity about reality, existence, and about their purpose. They have little tolerance for ambiguity, and they are searching for safety by huddling together with others. If a cult was given an option to create its own state, Israel is the example of it. It was no wonder I felt what I felt. I was pushing through forbidden boundaries I wasn't conscious I even knew. When it came to a choice between universal values, which would include supporting the plight of the Palestinians and the value of loyalty to my people, I was expected to put the latter first. By not making loyalty to my people my most cherished value, I was not only a traitor, but a person of extremely bad character. Bowen was clear that physically living is not the same as differentiation. Physically living is not the same as differentiation. What I did by moving to Australia and by renouncing my citizenship, Bowen would have called cutting off. Through the conscious process of differentiating from Israel, I became aware that differentiating meant leaving the group psychologically, emotionally, and spiritually, politically too, I guess. I had to let go of the identity that Israel expected me to have and become my own person. But in order to liberate my individual identity from Israeli identity, I had to go through an intense emotional struggle. It is the same struggle anyone who lives in a enmeshed cult-like group or family goes through. Groups that are too enmeshed and insecure make it difficult or impossible for people to differentiate. They prey on our natural instincts and desire for meaning and safety in life. They are guilty of not allowing people to develop to their potential, and in cases like Israel, of forcing people to collude with, whitewash, or cover up unspeakable crimes. In conclusion, in order to recover from my trauma, my childhood trauma, and earn the right to be a therapist and sit in front of clients, it was necessary for me to differentiate from my family of origin. To work towards becoming a decent human being and not waste my life as a bystander, watching and saying nothing as a crime against humanity unfolds in front of my eyes, it was necessary for me to differentiate from my entire culture. I have made a conscious choice to replace loyalty to the group I was born into with loyalty to my own values, to universal values, and to something greater than all of us. I do not believe any one human being or group are more valuable than another. All humans desire much more than just survival. We need to work to create a world where all human beings are enabled to fulfill their potential. But to do this work well and sustainably, we have to have a solid sense of ourselves. Thank you for your time and your patience. I appreciate it.
Well, thank you so much for this very powerful, powerful talk, and for your personal honesty and political awareness. As another self-hating Jew, I'm saying this to you, obviously. So we're going to start the Q&A now, and I do encourage people to write their questions in the chat box. If you don't know how to do that, you hover your cursor along the bottom of your screen, and there it says chat, and you click on it, and then you type in your question, and I will be monitoring these questions. So the first question that's come through is basically a thank you. And then the question, denouncing your Israeli citizenship sounds incredibly hard. Did you have any support for this action from others?
The support I received was mainly from my profession, from the people that educated me, and also from, obviously, the Palestinian community, the Muslim community in Australia, the Christian community in Australia, not from my circle so much. I didn't get any support there. There was a little bit of kind of solidarity with Jews who were nice, the nice type, the sort of liberal Zionist type. So they thought that we shared the same values, because we thought that was terrible what Israel was doing to the Palestinians and all that. But I was going too far, and so some of those dropped along the way when they realized I wasn't stopping with being a nice Zionist anymore. But I was very blessed, because the support I got was from, I met, my world expanded immeasurably. So yes, there was support.
And I have a question about something that just happened. I think it was yesterday. The Israeli government named 6 human rights organizations, many of them organizations that we've all personally worked with and supported, as terrorist groups. And yes. How would you talk about that to people, given your transformation and your understanding?
Look, I said in the beginning in my little introduction that here we have a situation where the perpetrator controls the narrative. So if they decide that groups of people who want to support the Palestinians are called terrorists, that's what they do. They just call them terrorists. What I ask of all activists is to search your own heart. You need to know what's true, what you understand is truth, and what your values are. It's up to everybody to search their own hearts about that. What bad people do. I mean, Israel's a bad country. The fact that they declare them as terrorists, that's nothing particularly surprising. I actually saw the same piece of news this morning, and I was thinking about it. Yeah, okay. We know what to expect of them. The question is, what are we going to do about it? What are we going to be silenced by it? Are we going to say, oh no, if I speak, I'm going to be declared a terrorist? And then what? Nothing ever changes if we allow the people who do the bad things to also basically determine for us what we're allowed and not allowed to do. Resistance does not come from the mainstream. The mainstream is the part that's bad. Is that part of society that does the bad things? Does that answer a question at all?
I think yeah, sure. I was just curious as to how you deal with that.
It's awful.
There's someone who's on a phone who has raised their hand. Does that mean you cannot use the chat on your phone? Because if you can't, why don't you unmute yourself and ask your question? I don't know what your question is.
Hi, my name is John Rodenberg, and it's true, I can't use the chat box because I'm not on the internet. My question is, what gave you the strength to formally announce your decision? And yeah, That's
Okay.
that's my question.
Great.
Well, as I tried to explain in my talk, I was on this path to train as a therapist, and becoming a therapist is not separate from who you are as a person. I can't live a split life. What gave me the strength is that I had to be true to myself at the end of the day. I remember speaking to, I don't know if anybody heard of Tanya Reinhardt. You remember Alice? She wrote, I think she,
right.
What did she write? She wrote a book on Gaza, I think, at some point. Tanya was an Israeli professor of linguistics who tragically died not long after I actually met her in Australia. And I remember I was still really, really troubled. And we had there was some kind of a function. And we had a dinner afterwards. And I took her aside and I asked her in Hebrew, I said, Tanya, is it hard for you to speak out? Because she was far ahead of me. And she looked at me and she said, it's harder not to. And I guess that's the answer to that question. What gave me the strength is that I had to choose. I had to choose the kind of person I want. If I look in the mirror, what kind of a person do I want to see looking back at me? Mm-hmm. It's really a matter of personal conscience at the end of the day.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So there are several people that want to know if Jewish spirituality has had a function for you in this whole journey.
No.
No.
Okay, I'm going to say some really seriously taboo things now, so bear with me.
Go for it.
The answer is absolutely not. I grew up as in very secular Israel. Israel in my time had the religious side was very, very small. I think it's growing. I think they've got a prime minister who wears a yarmulke, but not in my time. And I had no relationship with Jewish religion at all. When I went to university, I chose to go to Bar Ilan University because I wanted to learn something about Jewish religion because I didn't like it. Basically in Israel, unless you are following some kind of a religious lifestyle by some Jewish group, I mean, whichever group you belong to, it's not like denominations in the Christian world, but sort of different, slightly different lifestyles. But in other words, unless I was willing to live by the Jewish law, dress accordingly to what a woman is supposed to dress, eat the right foods, not eat the wrong foods, unless I followed all the law, I had no right to have a relationship with God. So I didn't have any kind of Jewish spirituality at all. In fact, frankly, this is the big taboo. I don't see much spiritual in the Judaism that I was exposed to. I'm not saying that there aren't people who do find it. I never saw it there. So no, that was not a part of it at all.
And when you look at Christian Zionism, have you confronted Christian Zionism in your activism, and how do you handle it?
They stay away from me. It's very far away.
Are they afraid of you?
No, Christian Zionism is a bit weird. Israel capitalizes on it because they'll take anybody who supports them. But I have good friends in the church, in various denominations in the church, and they explain to me that what Christian Zionism believes is something along the lines of when all the Jews congregate back in historic Palestine, Jesus will come the second time. So something like that. And then all the Jews will convert. So in what way is this particularly Jewish friendly? I don't know. I think it's all just pretty bizarre. But no, they stay away from me. Nobody talks to me from Christian Zionist circles ever. Nobody's ever spoken to me from there.
Okay. And some folks want to know how you actually countered the message of Hasbara, and how do you bring cracks to the Israeli propaganda machine? And people are wondering what is going to bring us to a tipping point where something changes besides, the usual all the governments stand with Israel kind of behavior.
Well, the Hasbara is very insidious and very tricky. It was going on inside Israel and it was going outside Israel. And it's only when I left to Australia that I realized how far reaching it is and how many people have been having the same ideas about Israel that we grew up with, which have nothing to do with reality. I didn't try to counter it because there's no point in it. What happened to me is that I started to study, I started to learn. And I read, well, it first was with Avi Shleim, and Avi Shleim, let me tell you, is very mild. But then I read Ilan Pape, and I read a whole lot of other scholars. You, I think yourself, Alice, I think I read some of your writings as well. And over the years, I've read many. I'm not a historian. I had to learn from historians. And I realized that basically what the Hasbara was doing is, to be honest, well, it's just propaganda. And I have to say, I didn't want to repeat the story I wrote in Beyond Tribal Loyalties in this talk. I want to talk about a different facet of what happened. In Beyond Tribal Loyalties, I'm explaining the bits and bobs of the journey that got me to get to that point. Here I was trying to talk about what it was like. Mm-hmm. In Beyond Tribal Loyalties, though, I'm talking about how I did notice as a child even that there were things that didn't quite add up. Especially if you travel through Israel, say, oh, that's a ruined Arab village. That's a ruined Arab village. That's a ruined Arab village. It took us on a lot of excursions at school, and I didn't really understand it. But some things didn't quite add up. But you never had anybody to talk to about this, so I couldn't question it. I had no tools growing up to question it. Mm-hmm. I forgot what the other part of the question was.
I think that it's more. What will bring us to a tipping point? And yeah, I don't know that any of us know this.
Listen, I'm a psychotherapist. Psychotherapists don't go out looking for clients. Clients come to us. I don't think Israel is ready for psychotherapy. I used to be talking about Israel psychology and Israel's trauma and all of that, but I really don't think that we should be sitting there looking Palestinians in the eye. You have to live day after day after day in the hell that they live in, and tell them, oh, we'll just wait until Israelis get a clue. I think this is a situation similar to South Africa. Unless there's action from the outside, nothing will ever change. That means that our job as individuals and as groups in our own countries is to put pressure on our politicians and to start pushing strongly towards divestment, sanctions, and boycotting of Israel. And there's little dots of light in that. In the Highland Council, that we've succeeded. A group that works for Palestinian Palestinian advocacy group managed to get the Highland Council pension fund to divest from General Dynamics. How they were ever invested in that in the first place, I don't understand, but they were. So even in a small way, this sends a message. We need to write to our MPs. We need to write to our president, which is just not okay that we are all complicit in a crime against humanity if we continue to live in our countries, and our governments are doing that. They're supporting it. Israel did not boycott South Africa. I think Margaret Thatcher didn't want to boycott South Africa. They all held out all to the bitter end, and eventually the whole thing collapsed. We don't have time to wait until Israel gets itself psychoanalyzed or sees the light. It's not going to happen. The pressure has to come from outside, and it will come through boycott, sanctions, and divestment. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. My humble opinion, of course.
I completely agree with you. Another question is looking at the United States, and you're a family therapist, and do you see a psychological explanation for the US's uncompromising support of the Israeli government? Is it more political, economic, military, industrial, maybe all of the above? How do you see that?
Well, Israel's a settler colonial state. So is the United States. So is the United States. So is Canada. So is Australia. And the United Kingdom is a major, or used to be a major, colonial power. So look at who the friends of Israel are. If the United States really stopped supporting Israel, if Australia stopped supporting, I used to live in Australia, I'm an Australian citizen. If these countries stopped supporting Israel, they will probably have to look at their own dirty past. And I think this is happening in little bits and bobs here and there. But a real reckoning with this country's history. I mean, from the little that I understand from what's going on in the United States, there's a lot of struggle there with First Nation people, with African Americans, many pasts, many sins of the past are still not being acknowledged properly, and there's still a lot of problems with that. So, I don't think we should wait until these countries get a clue. But it's typical that settler colonial countries will support a settler colonial country. And of course, there are the geopolitical issues, which I'm not an expert on, but my partner knows better about that. But, right. It's advantageous to the United States to, so right. It's a similar psychology, I think.
Right. So this is not the time to go into the geopolitical, but it's a lot about military and power and oil and all those kinds of things. There's someone who wants to know if the relationships that you valued back when you were in the cult have you been able to preserve them, or have you lost all previous relation? Is it like you close the door and it's over kind of thing?
Completely lost. So my family was terrible, but I was very fortunate in my education. I owe my life to my teachers, both in primary and secondary school. And in my secondary school in particular, I had a wonderful group of our cohort, our class. We finished school, there were 20 of us in the class, and we were really, really close friends. And I absolutely loved them. And we had great relationships together. We're a really good group. I also had my own friends from outside of school, and all of that is gone. Nobody's allowed to go anywhere near me because of the fact that I'm an anti-Zionist. It's happened a long time ago, years and years and years ago. Just absolutely no contact, and I have clear evidence that that's the case. I mean, there's been attempts to make contact, and then somebody says, "Oh, you can't talk to her," and then that stops. So no, there's absolutely no contact. My entire family I have a big faction, part of the family on my mother's side, who are all living in Germany. They're all deeply staunch Zionists. None of them will go anywhere near me. In fact, nobody will. I'm considered insane, basically. You're talking to an insane woman right now. So this is how you justify to yourself not having to listen to somebody. So they're just crazy. You don't have to listen to them. So
Right.
No, I have I have nobody left there, actually. Lots of blood family, lots of ex-friends, but no real connections. The friends I do have now are all anti-Zionists in Israel, which is incredible.
So you have a new community, a new family.
Absolutely, yeah, that's right. Yeah.
So there are two therapists that are asking therapy kind of questions. One is, how do you apply if you do, clinical trauma therapy to Israelis, Zionists, Jews in general? And the other is asking how do you see the role of trauma when you interact with sort of the framework of Zionism and understanding Israeli policy through the trauma lens? So it's a trauma question.
Well, I think trauma is a defining principle of all of it. And I don't think, though, that trauma started with Zionism. I think trauma is embedded in Jewish religion and in Jewishness. It's part of identity of Jewishness. I don't, obviously, as a therapist and as I see myself as a former sufferer of trauma myself. I don't blame people for having trauma, but I do blame organizations like a state, like Israel, for example, who instead of doing something to encourage healing from it, so everybody does something to get better, the state of Israel is actually perpetuating trauma on generations of children. When I was 6 years old at school, they would sit us in front of endless slideshows with pictures of Auschwitz, of the liberation pictures of Auschwitz with the kids, the poor kids with the stripy pajamas, and we constantly studied about the poor children who had nothing to eat in the Warsaw Ghetto, and all they had is the potato peels, and dreadful stuff like that. You don't know what to do with yourself. And at that age, and there was no emotional support, it was intended to traumatize us. And the message was specifically and quite explicitly, this could be you. If you were there, this would be you. So this is deliberately intended to traumatize you. This kind of cult mentality causes multi-generational transmission. The therapists amongst the listeners would know what I'm talking about. Multi-generational transmission doesn't have to be caused by actual abuse. It can be through values, through principles. I have clients who were traumatized by families who never even laid a finger on them, but the family was racist. The family expressed hatred and judgment against other people, superiority against other people, and sensitive, lovely children get damaged by that. They get scared by that. It's a way of creating a world that's not safe for children. Children can't relax in it. So what causes trauma, my colleagues there will know, is being in a prolonged state of not being able to relax. Basically, that's what childhood trauma is caused by. You're living in an environment that doesn't pay off to relax. There's no point relaxing because the bear's right there and it's going to get you. So if you perpetuate that kind of environment, so I think trauma plays a big part in Zionist identity and in what Zionism has done in Palestine. But I always, when I stopped talking about it publicly, because I worry that that will be considered as a kind of an excuse. So they're traumatized, they're victims, therefore they don't know what they're doing. I'm sorry, that's not the case. I was traumatized out of my brains coming from my family of origin. I was able to somehow, I don't know, with a lot of help, but I was able to get out of it. And I think it's the responsibility of anybody who's traumatized to do something about it. And particularly when the person's trauma is harmful to others. So when you do harm to other people, when you behave in ways that are not okay to others, that's when you should stop. That's when you should start thinking. Israel has long gone past that, you know?
Right.
So, like I said, I'm not going to wait until Israel gets therapy.
So I get that. And I'm wondering, there are two questions about basically Israel getting therapy. It says, how do you do group consciousness raising in that society, and other people in Israel who choose to remain, basically to do that, who have perspectives similar to yours? Or do you feel like it's a hopeless situation and you've got to do BDS and international, pressure, and the Israelis are hopeless? Like, how do you read that?
Well, my sense is that the latter is right, that we need to put pressure from outside because the change will not come from the inside. However, there are people much, much more informed and better than me. For example, if you read Ilan Pape's, everybody heard of Professor Ilan Pape? He left Israel.
Probably, yeah.
And he's now teaching in Exeter University in England. Ilan and his wife, his partner Sylvia, were running seminars in their own living room for people to try and educate about Israel's history, because they know that people don't know that. They don't teach you at school this sort of stuff. And he writes about this in his book, Out of the Frame, which I highly recommend. And I think you'll get your answer there and then you get your own impression. Is it possible? Is it likely? What's likely? I don't think it's likely that these kinds of activities will convert a lot of people, or that there could be enough people converted to make a difference. It doesn't seem likely. Israel is going the opposite direction, if you're asking me. Mm-hmm. Israel is determined to continue and complete the settler colonial project. So that's why I do believe that the option of pressure from the outside is the more valid one.
Okay. There is a question about the need to challenge the private profit system, profit-making system of all sorts of things that US and Israel shares to get rid of Zionism. I think the BDS answer is the challenge to that system there. So there's someone who wants to know, who are your allies today, and who do you find or identify as a community?
You are, and pretty much all of the people I have the good fortune to meet through my work, my partner, very close friends. I have friends who I don't have DNA in common with. Well, unless the human DNA, of course, but not, they're not my heritages, and I was not born to them or have so-called blood in common. I'm very fortunate. I find kindred spirits everywhere. I'm not complaining, honestly. I don't feel alone at all.
Right. Yeah, it's not alone.
It's a nice question. Thank you. It's a very caring question. I appreciate that.
And there's someone here who wants to encourage people to look at to be a Facebook friend for you and review your posts. So that's good.
Or not.
There's a question about the importance of confronting capitalism in the United States and as a global system to tackle Zionism. And this person is asking, as a socialist feminist.
Yeah, I agree. I am personally, I guess my inclinations politically are moving in the direction of anarchism, in a sense of anarchism being, I'll tell you what, oh, just dropped the book. Anarchism is being a system where people really cooperate. They really support each other, not anarchism as in burning out places, and anarchism properly, the political movement of anarchism. This is my understanding of it. So capitalism has no place in it because it's not about competition. It's not about dog eat dog. It's about cooperation. It's about my real ethos is, as a psychotherapist, I come from the humanistic kind of spiritual background, which means that I believe that every human being wants to develop to their full potential. When we push people through the capitalist system to live back in the jungle where its might is right and you just have to fight and struggle for your next paycheck and your next, feeding your children, and you don't know if you can pay the rent. This does not lend itself to people developing to their potential. So I'd like to see a world organized around that, around the thing that we all share as human beings, which is the need to be everything that we can become. Our world does not actually support that, and capitalism definitely does not support that. Capitalism is intended for those who are more ruthless and don't mind stepping on other people to get what they want. So. And feminism is, well, there's no question about that in my mind. I'm a woman, so yeah.
I need to ask a technical question, Huda. It's 11:16 now. How much, am I over time for questions, or how long can we go? You need to unmute yourself.
Yeah, Alice, you can continue on a little bit. This is Anne.
Yes, we have some time.
Okay, we got some time. Okay, so why don't you give me a clue when we're out of time? So there's now here a question from a Moroccan Jew, Moroccan North African, asking about Moroccans and North African Jewish people and their descendants. Is their relationship to Zionist cult the same, given that they're different than European Jews? And this person notes that even now they seem to be proud of their background and still have loyalty to their home countries.
It's definitely not an area of expertise, so I can tell you just a little bit of what I know, and that is that when I mentioned Moroccan Jews, I mentioned people coming from Arab-speaking countries, brought into Israel and treated really, really badly, actually. But eventually, the idea was that they will assimilate in Israel, and I think eventually people from those backgrounds found their place in Israel. And they are just as staunchly Zionist as anybody else. I don't know how many remain who still see that as wrong. And I think those who did might have left Israel as well. Mm-hmm. I know that there were people who left Israel and went to other countries because they couldn't bear living there. I know that people who lived in Arab-speaking countries, in Arab countries, did not see their countries as the enemy. Israel told them that they were the enemy. They did not feel unwelcome there. They did not feel persecuted there. But it's definitely not my area. I mean, it's something worth looking at.
Sure.
Actually.
And there's a question that seems clear. You don't think Israelis are reaching a tipping point in a positive way, but what about world opinion? Do you think world opinion is getting to some tipping point, or we have endless ways to go?
Well, okay, I have no data to base it on, but it seems like it needs to be rigorous if we're going to make definitive statements. I don't have any data, so it's hard to tell. But there does seem to be more openness to talk about the Palestinians as human beings, and more opening to see what's going on. There were there was the Israeli human rights group who put the term settler colonialism on the table and apartheid on the table for the first time. The Guardian just recently published an article that I don't think they would have ever published before, and everybody's piggybacking on those two groups, and that said, oh, because they had the guts to say it, now everybody's thinking, oh, because somebody has to stick their head out in this world before somebody else is prepared to follow. Mm-hmm. So it takes somebody to do that. And like I said in my talk, I think it's a terrible shame that we need something like courage to do the obvious. Yeah. But I think I'd like to hope there's a tipping point. But then again, all it takes is some lunatic in the United States or in the UK or whatever to start a war on China. And then what happens? Everybody's attention is diverted elsewhere. So just when I think, it might be looking good, I don't know what these people are going to pull from the under the hat. So my crystal ball's not working. I'm a hopeful person in general,
Good. Well, that's good. So here's a question about Palestinian resistance. What do you think of Palestinian resistance, armed or otherwise? Do you consider it terrorism for Palestinians to defend themselves and their land in any way possible against a 73-year-old military occupation?
Okay, of course, I don't advocate anybody killing anybody. However, I don't think that I don't think Israel is giving Palestinians much choice, really. Israel has been on a systematic rampage of killing everybody who was considered so-called moderate within the Palestinian resistance. And so what was left is what Israel likes to demonize as terrorism. And the narrative's been like that for decades. The terrorists, but also there's a problem for me with the word resistance in principle, because I think people think of resistance as just taking guns and shooting people. Resistance comes in many forms. For people to insist on maintaining their dignity, on educating their children right, on maintaining their values as human beings, on keeping doing what they do, doing art, doing academic work, doing medicine, doing whatever it is they do, being farmers, continuing to tend to their fields despite all odds, that is also resistance. I think the word resistance is not, the scope of what resistance is often overlooked. Mm-hmm. Writing books, speaking, just insisting on being a decent human being and being there, cooking. I've learned to cook Palestinian food as a form of solidarity with Palestinian people. You know, there are Palestinian cookbooks being published. Israel wanted to obliterate Palestinian identity completely. But when people have a cuisine, when they have a culture, they don't disappear. So I have Palestinian cookbooks. I mean, there are many, many forms of resistance, but ultimately, to be honest with you, if people are pushed to the wall, what do you expect them to do? Do you want them to just die? Is that what the Jews did? Mm-hmm. You know, we were raised on our so-called right? Underground movements, the Irgun and the Haganah and the Lehi. When I was a child, they were heroes. Nobody called them terrorists. I was absolutely shocked when I read in the British press, when I was doing some research for my honors, and then I went to Hansard records of the British Parliament, and I read that these were called terrorists. I was absolutely stunned. Right. What terrorists? But these were my heroes. So, you know, what do you want? Israel deliberately does this. I mean, every oppressor knows this. You push people sufficiently to the corner and they will have to fight. And when they fight, it gets dirty and then you can demonize them. It's a perfect trap. I call it a psychopathic system. You put people in a position where they have no choice. You have I work with women in domestic violence situation, terrible things. It's called domestic coercive control, and where's absolute control and horrendous stuff. When the woman finally resists and might have to use some kind of violence, then everybody looks at her and she's the bad guy. You know, it's not fair. You put people in impossible situations, what do you expect them to do? So no, I don't support people killing people. I think the whole thing should be dismantled. The whole settler colonials, it's a power structure. The Palestinians have no power. Israel's taken all the power. So what do we want, you know? So I'm not going to sit here and say, oh, I condemn violence and Israel has a right to defend. No, I don't. This is nonsense from the Western media trying to appear balanced. There is no balance here. There's no symmetry. One side has all the power, the other side has none. And we have to remember that. And sometimes powerless people have to resort to strong measures to fight for themselves, or else they die. Unless they get help, of course.
There's a question here that says, what do you tell people who believe a Jewish state is necessary to protect Jews?
Well, I would say it would have been an interesting idea in theory if it didn't come at the expense of another people. If a group of people want to live in their own little ghetto, in their own little place, because they feel that that's better for them, okay, fine, knock yourself out. But as soon as that comes at the expense of another people, it becomes a crime. And that's what the Zionists did. If people want to have their own state, okay, fine, I wouldn't be there, but okay. But if it has to be a house invasion, if it means that I have to evict you from your house and go and live in it instead of you, that's a crime now. So, no. So and I think Jews can take their chances elsewhere in the world, and I think they'll find that the world is not really all anti-Semitic and all wanting to kill us all the time. So there.
So I think this is going to be the last question. This person is asking Mark Braverman to comment on the whole tipping question. So I think, you know, maybe therapist to therapist, you two could like have a little conversation about the tipping point question. Mark, you want to unmute yourself?
I can't see which
Yeah,
page
let's
is
see
he
here.
on.
Let's see, is he here?
Yeah, hi.
Oh,
Hi,
hello, Mark.
Abigail.
I can see
Hi,
you there.
Abigail. Yeah,
Hi.
I feel like you just giving my speech. I mean, it's like we're like,
Sure.
I mean, we come from somewhat different backgrounds. I have to think about, you know, I came from a family that sounds like, I keep telling myself I wasn't traumatized, but another funny thing that sometimes I often have the imagine, I mean, my family was pious. My mother was very Jewish chauvinist and all of that. And I think she victimized, she sacrificed her family for the rabbis that she idolized and eroticized and all this other stuff. But I often have the fantasy that somebody in the audience is going to stand up and say, you know, all of your activism and all of your anti-Zionism and all of it, you're just angry at your mother, you know?
That's what I was told.
Well, yeah, and so you know, I hope somebody will do that someday, because my answer is, you're absolutely right. I am really angry with my mother, and that doesn't change any of this. You know, the reality is still the reality. Anyway, the tipping point question. I mean, all of my work has been with the churches, and they sort of in the United States and actually elsewhere in Germany as well. I've come to the conclusion, or at least it's my theory, it's my story, and I'm sticking to it, that the churches have an incredibly critical role to play here. And I talk about our own civil rights movement, and I think about the anti-apartheid struggle, where it wasn't just Desmond Tutu. I mean, the entire ecumenical Reformed churches of the world basically excommunicated their churches in South Africa, and the rest of the churches of the world came in behind them. And that was it was a big factor with the Thatcher governments and the Reagan governments as well, especially the Reagan government, because we have so many Christians here. So I want the churches of the world to do what they did for South Africa, to do that for Israel and for the Palestinians, of course, but also to rescue the Israelis, like the South Africans were rescued from apartheid. And that's where I'm seeing the tipping point. That's where I'm seeing the tipping point, that the churches more and more are starting to confront Christian Zionism, say that, you know, this is really not being with Jesus supporting the Israelis, and to go back to their Bibles and reread them and say, this couldn't really be what the Bible says, and certainly not what Jesus said. And we are seeing a tipping point there, and it's a political sort of organizing strategy and a theory for me that to work through the churches for that reason. And it's changing. I think there is a tipping point happening with the churches, and that gives me some hope that will play some part, to your point about it coming from the outside, that will play some part in changing the political wind. The other factor there is also the Palestinian Christians, who are a powerful, powerful force in Palestine, not in Israel, not in 48 Israel, but in the West Bank certainly. And they have managed to organize very effectively, and a whole international global network of churches has responded to the Palestinian Christians. And that's been very, very powerful. What I'm looking for is for the political activists in Israel, Jewish and Palestinian, as well as outside, to connect the dots and to connect with the churches and realize how much potential there is in there. And this organization, Kairos Puget Sound, this is the Kairos movement, and the Puget Sound folks who invited you are part of this network.
Mark, you should write something about it and then publish it in Haaretz. Maybe somebody will listen. No, I'm serious.
Well, yeah, I mean, I've written a lot, but not so much in political journals. I published with Norma Salha and others in the UK, but not in Israel. You think Haaretz would, yeah, it's interesting. I've had no exposure in Haaretz. I'll give that a try.
Go for it.
Also, Ilan and his One Democratic State program. I've also spoken with him about this and encouraged him to, I said, you doing any work at all with the Palestinians in the West Bank? And do you know about what the Christians are doing? And he doesn't really. And I think those dots need to be connected as well. Maybe you and I can correspond more about this. Sorry?
Sounds like
Yeah.
you're the man to do it.
Well, maybe you and I can correspond more about this in terms of your
I
connections in
encourage
the
you.
UK as well. Yeah.
Looks like a match made in heaven here, guys. There's one last question that I actually don't fully understand, so I'm going to read it and see if you understand it. Can you please describe how do these tipping points play a part in the internal architecture of a Zionist, and how these encounters can become more possible away from the propaganda of peace-building conflict resolution narratives? Again, maybe.
I think I do understand the question. It's from Nasser, is that right?
Yeah. Yeah.
In order to save time, I can say I've actually spoken exactly about that in my book, in Beyond Tribal Loyalties, in my own particular contribution. It's got 25 stories, one of them is mine, and that's exactly what I'm addressing. It's not just one thing. It's not I meet a Palestinian man as an equal or a woman and suddenly everything changes. It doesn't work like that. There's a lot of experience that, for me anyway, a whole lot of experience that joined together to bring me to that point that I am now, and some processes that are internal to me. But you will read the stories of other activists who have a different, their tipping point was different, and they explain how that happened for them. So I to save time, maybe Nasser, it's a good idea if you had a look at the book, and I think you'll find your answers there. And then if you wanted to talk to me, you can always email me as well. My email is public.
Okay. So this is the absolute last question. The question is, how strong is the anti-Zionist movement in Israel?
It's small, but they are very, well, I talked about why do we need courage, but if you're inside Israel and you're doing this, you definitely do need courage. And they're amazing people, but they're not the majority. Mm-hmm. And they are being harassed by Israel. In Israel, it's not illegal to question legally, but there are informal ways that they make people's lives very, very difficult once they are starting to do that. So they're there, and that I think that the fact that they are there is significant, how big or small they are. And in fact, there have been anti-Zionists before my time in Israel that I didn't even know about. And that was the Communist Party in Israel, Matzpen, the movement there. They were already anti-Zionist before anybody else was, and the Bundists were there too. But they're kind of, you know, the mainstream Zionist narrative is so powerful, and it's so insidious. They teach every bit of it at school from the moment you're born. It's right there, all 24 hours, 24/7. It's all the time there, through the rituals, through the ceremonies, through the teachings, through the media, through the programs on television. Once in a while, I do a bit of a, you know, go down memory lane, and I look on YouTube to see childhood programs that I used to see in Israel that sometimes people post on YouTube, and I'm horrified to see how Zionist they were. I used to enjoy them. They were just children's programs, but they're all Zionist. All the songs I used to sing, SP singer, so all the songs I used to sing in choirs and all were all Zionist, nationalist songs. I would never sing them now, but I loved them. They were lovely, you know. It's done in such a profound way that is the prevailing. That's not just it's the majority of people are like that. That's part of what I was trying to talk about, is that it's your identity. It's not something that you learn as separate. You learn your country's history. That's who you are. But the fact that there is an anti-Zionist group or movements in Israel itself is the fact that they're there is significant, even if they're small.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, well, I think this concludes our Q&A, and I just want to thank you so much, because this has really been wonderful, and I'm going to turn this over back to Huda.
Thank you.
You're muted, Huda.
Again, very, very, very much, I mean, it was a
Is Huda breaking up for everybody or just for me?
Yes, Huda, you're breaking up for everybody. And you went on to a view instead of your gallery. And so we're not seeing everybody on the screen.
I
Thank
had
you,
done that to
Abigail.
spotlight Huda, but I can leave it on gallery view if that's what people prefer.
It shouldn't matter about breaking up.
Okay. Maybe I should come and just say my last few words to your computer, Anne.
Now is,
Yeah, we can
Okay.
hear you well now.
Okay. I just want to say this was a stunning, stunning revelation for me, and I'm sure for everyone who heard you. If we were all together in person, you would be hounded with many, many more questions, I'm sure. But I want to also emphasize your book, Beyond Tribal Loyalties. I think this is something that, yes, good. I'm glad you held it up. Thank you. You can order it. Where can people order it from, Abigail?
Sadly, Amazon or your bookstore.
Okay, very good. Okay.
I'm sorry to plug, but the story here complements the story I told you today. So they two fit together into one, I think, one narrative, really.
Very good. It's good to know
Thank you,
that. So
Huda.
people, okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Alice, also very much for spearheading and guiding the question and answer periods. Alice is, I know, very busy usually with writing and filmmaking and so on. But she did devote her time to us today, and I'm very, very grateful for that, Alice. Thank you, Anne, too, for masterminding this, the technical part of all of this. And barring anything else, a final thank you to Abigail, and barring anything else, I'm going to close this and say goodbye to you all until we have our holiday event, and you'll be hearing more about it in the coming weeks. So goodbye, and thank you all very, very much indeed.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
thank you, Abigail.
You're welcome. Thank you for coming.